If you're blue and you don't know where to go to, why don't you go where Harlem sits, putting on the Ritz.
And now for something completely different.
Welcome back to Rod's Radios. And yes, this is something completely different. The radios I've been working on up to now are from normally European countries, and this American one looks completely different. It seems to operate in a completely different way in terms of how the circuit is laid out, etc. So when I got it, I had no idea what brand it was. There was no evidence on the outside as to what it was. So it was time to have a look inside. Looking inside the cabinet, there was a label stuck to the left-hand side wall, and I could see that it identified this radio as a Crosley model 728-A. However, I couldn't find any identification on the internet of what this radio was. It seemed to be very obscure, and I hunted around and around, and eventually I came across something very similar, which turned out to be a Crosley model 718. And luckily the circuit diagram was attached to the details of this radio. And the only difference I can see between the 728 and the 718 is that the model on the circuit diagram was the American version, which had a shortwave and medium wave section in it. Whereas this particular radio must have been made for the European market, because it has, as well as shortwave and medium wave, it has a long wave band. And actually on the front of the radio, I can see labelled along the push buttons various stations identified as European. Certainly the first one is our own one here, Radio Éireann, which was the national and is the national broadcasting company here in Ireland. And further along, I can see the BBC Droitwich transmitter, which was over in the UK, and some of the other UK stations. So this radio was definitely made for the market over here, even though it is an American radio. So time to have a further look inside to see what's on the chassis. The chassis is very tightly packed with components, large looking valves, the likes of which I've never seen before. They're quite different to the normal small mini watt valves I've seen in European radios. So that's going to be interesting to try and negotiate around them. Now, if the valves are faulty, I have no hope of progressing with this radio, because you just can't get them over here anymore. However, we'll see what happens. While underneath the chassis in a separate compartment, I can see a loudspeaker with two transformers, one strapped onto the side of the speaker and another separately mounted just above it on the wooden part. So I don't know what's going on there, because some of the wires are actually disconnected. It looks as though someone added on a transformer at some stage, so I'm sure this radio has been worked on during its history. But we'll have a look underneath the chassis to see what awaits us there. Looking underneath, I can see that this radio has definitely been worked on. There are various components that have been replaced. This, for instance, is one of the HT smoothing capacitors. There's another one in here, another grey one that has been replaced. The volume control is not the original, definitely. It's a newer version, and I can see where whoever fitted it strapped together the on-off switch contacts, because this is a single pole switch for this radio rather than a double pole, so that might have to be changed. Apart from that, there's lots of capacitors here, wax capacitors, 1, 2, 3, at least 4, and I'm sure there are more that will need to be replaced. They're always doubtful. And in a radio of this age, that isn't surprising. So we'll have to see how we get on with this. The first thing to do is to replace the crustified mains lead on the front edge here. You can just see the tip of it. It's very much decomposed, and it runs inside here up to the on-off switch. So that's the first thing to be replaced, after which I shall switch on tentatively and see if any sound comes out of this at all. I've just spotted another resistor that I'm sure was replaced. It's a more modern looking resistor, wouldn't have been one of the original ones. So a little bit of work to be done on this before we find out if there's any sound at all coming out of it. Interesting. looking at the circuit diagram for what is the nearest equivalent to the actual radio I have here, I can see that the layout is completely different to the type of European radio that I'm used to. As an example, all the symbols for the valves here are all over the place. These ones are kind of upside down to the way we'd normally see them in the European radios. This one is side on, etc., etc. Some of the symbols are a little bit different. For instance, there's this symbol here, which I would normally associate with a light bulb, but it's actually the on-off switch. This is the light bulb over here. And over here, I can see what explains when I mentioned about the transformers strapped onto the loudspeaker. This is a completely different arrangement, but I gather it was typical of loudspeakers before permanent magnets were part of the construction. Because in this case, there's a separate, what they call a field coil within the area of the loudspeaker to create a magnet. And that is, if you like, fed by one of the HT lines to create an electromagnet, for want of a better word. So as well as the output transformer here fed onto the voice coil of the speaker, there's a separate field coil to magnetize the speaker to allow the cone to move in and out. So that's quite different. And apart from that, the other thing I see, which is unusual for me, but I'm sure many American people who work on radios will be familiar with it, in that the one side of the secondary of the mains transformer, I would normally associate as being strapped down to earth. This is the earth line along here. However, it's not. It's floating for some reason. It's fed via the speaker plug through the field coil and back out through a series of resistors, which eventually find its way to the earth line. So I think that is to create a kind of a floating earth or something like that, to enable the grids of the valves to be fed negatively with respect to earth. So again, that's something different to contend with, but nevertheless, other than that, it's a super heterodyne radio which follows all the normal rules. The circuit diagram is only different in this area over here, where with this radio, the American version, it has just a shortwave and broadcast band, or medium wave, so shortwave and medium wave, whereas the radio I have has an extra wave band, a long wave band, with an extra set of coils somewhere over here. So I think it's time now to actually switch on the radio, connect it up as best I can, and see if we get any sound out of it. Well, the news is not good, I'm afraid. When I started doing the fault finding process on it, the first thing I found was that the rectifier valve wasn't working at all. There was no B plus voltage at all. And it seems that either the cathode or the grid or the anode is actually open circuit. Nothing coming out of it whatsoever. So what I did to try and push this forward was to install here, you may be able to see a little diode, a 1N4007 diode. This is capable of handling 1 amp, so it should be more than enough. So I bypassed the cathode and the anode of the valve with this diode, and suddenly I had B+. It came up absolutely perfectly. So I moved on from there. There was still no sound when the radio was switched on. So the next thing was to go back to the amplifier stage. The output valve in this is a 6V6G, and there was a buzz coming off the grid when I touched it. So that seemed to be okay, but everything was dead apart from that. So I went back one stage further to the previous valve, which is a 6F5G. So that's the first stage of the AF amplifier, and nothing at all coming out of the grid. However, on the anode, there was something, a buzz as before when I touched it. And in taking the valve out to have a look at it, I discovered it was stone cold. And here is the valve in question, and I couldn't see it when it was fitted into the set, but there is a milkiness here that is an indication that air has got into this valve. But actually what was wrong with it was that the heater circuit was open circuit. So that's the second valve faulty in this radio. And to try and move it forward again, if you look down at the bottom of the chassis here, I have bypassed this valve that I've just shown you with a capacitor to see if I could get the signal to come through. And lo and behold, I got a very scratchy, noisy reception coming through on long wave. The only station we have here in Ireland is the National Radio RTE, or Radio Éireann as it used to be called. And that was coming through very weakly and scratchy. Obviously the valve not being in place, this first stage AF amplifier, was causing that. So 2 valves gone, and even with that working in a fashion, the magic eye on the front of the radio here was absolutely dead as well. So that's 3 valves gone in this radio. So things are looking pretty bad now at this stage. To replace these, I went online to get some idea of how much the valves would cost, and they would come in the region of around 140, 150 euros for the 3 valves to get them in from the States on eBay or wherever. So this is kind of out of the question for this radio, unfortunately. On top of which, if you did get these in, these could be second-hand valves, new, old stock, whatever, with no guarantee whatsoever that they're actually going to be working. So I think I have to bite the bullet on this. This radio is not going to be restored in its original state, unfortunately. The cost is too high and things could go wrong even if I did get the valves in. So I have to rethink this. What do I do? Do I scrap it? Do I throw it out? Seems like a shame that I couldn't do something with it. The other option is to convert it into a Bluetooth receiver. And this is a possibility. And the owner of the set actually mentioned this when I spoke to him about it. And he would be keen on this to be done in the event that the radio can't be fixed. And I don't think it can be at this stage, which is a shame. But I'm going to have to go away now and think about how I'm going to fit a Bluetooth unit into this radio. There is no position on the waveband switch to allow a gram input to be connected independently of the radio. There is a connection on the back of the chassis itself, but there is no connection for this. So I may have to just put a Bluetooth unit into it, a separate Bluetooth unit containing an amplifier, etc., and try and run the volume control in the existing position with the on-off switch included to switch this on and off. So back to the drawing board. This is the proposed Bluetooth amplifier for this particular radio, and I've mounted the bits and pieces onto a sheet of Perspex, and the sheet of Perspex will go into the base of the radio. And here we have the mains lead coming in through a block connector via a fuse here at the back and into this little transformer, mains transformer, that gives an output of 9 volts, AC of course. The AC comes out here and goes into this little panel here, which has a bridge rectifier and smoothing capacitor. And out comes about 13, 14 volts DC, which is what the amplifier needs to run it correctly. And this is the amplifier module here, on top of which sits the little Bluetooth section. And you can see a flashing light here which shows it's looking for a Bluetooth pairing code, which it isn't joined to at the moment. And separately I have just a temporary volume control to see if it works, and it does. Eventually I'll get a proper volume control which will go into the front of the radio, combined with a mains switch which will control the mains coming into the whole unit itself. And this is the replacement. This is obviously a modern loudspeaker, roughly the same size as the previous one. And coincidentally, the holes in the cabinet of the radio are exactly in the same place as far as the new speaker is concerned. So that's a bit of luck. Having decided to remodel this radio rather than restore it, it was time to pay some attention to the cabinet. And this involved using paint stripper to peel back the layers of varnish that was crazed, cracked, scratched and marked. This involved 3 separate sessions of painting, scraping, scrubbing and washing off the detritus that came off. It's like scraping off thick layers of thick brown treacle. Yuck. After 3 similar sessions, this is what the cabinet now looks like, and it's ready for wood dyeing and varnishing. After several coats of wood dye and varnish, the cabinet looks a whole lot better. The labels on the buttons of the radio itself were faded, worn, and in fact some were missing, so I printed up some new ones to smarten things up a bit. With the cabinet finished, I now turn my attention to the chassis itself and the illumination on the dial drive. Now originally there was a 6.3 volt bulb fed by the voltage coming from the chassis itself, but now there's no chassis working, so the only voltage I have is the 14 volt feed from the module, the Bluetooth module. So I decided to fit some LEDs instead, and you can see here where I have mounted on the left side and actually also on the right side 3 LEDs. They're warm white LEDs to give that sort of warm glow that you expect from a vintage radio, and I connected them all in parallel, so I have 6 LEDs in parallel, and by fiddling around with the series resistor, taking into account the 14 volt supply, I now have each LED dropping about 10 milliamps, which is about right. So here you can see a shot of both sides of the chassis with 3 LEDs on both sides, and when I switch on the power, this is what it looks like. It'll look better when it's in the chassis itself because you won't see the reflection on either side. You should just see the panel illuminated. Above you can see the original volume control stroke on-off switch from the old chassis, which I've had to replace because the old one was a 1 meg log track on the volume control, whereas the Bluetooth module requires a 50k linear track instead. So here's the new one underneath, and I've pre-wired it in preparation to pop into the chassis and then wire into the Bluetooth module. The new amplifier stroke Bluetooth module mounted onto the Perspex panel along with its associated components is now being attached to the underside of the cabinet along with the loudspeaker, the new loudspeaker as you can see, and I've brought all the wiring from the volume control in through the side of the cabinet, the inner side of the cabinet, and wired it in, plugged it into the module. So now I think we're good to go. If you remember, this is what it looked like originally, and what was a radio is now a Bluetooth speaker. Time to hear what this thing sounds like. Well, the purists watching this may be horrified as to what I've done with this old radio, but unfortunately this was a bin job. This was going to end up in a skip because of the fact I couldn't get the parts for it, or the parts just weren't available. So I think the guy who owns this radio, or now a Bluetooth speaker, will be happy with the outcome. I'm sure he will be. So, if you have been, thanks for watching.